Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks for returning for the fourth of our 4 lectures on the first day of our annual Sacred Trust lecture series. This series, of course, it comes to you courtesy of the Gettysburg National Military Park and the Gettysburg Foundation. And we are delighted to bring to you some of the best work from currently active scholars and folks from the public history world and park rangers and licensed battlefield guides and all elements of the historical community whose talents are being combined together to give us a picture of the Civil War that we don't always get if all we ever read is Gettysburg, Gettysburg, Gettysburg. Not that there's anything wrong with that, because Lord knows that's what some of us do. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Varon. Her talk, as you can see up here, Reconsidering Longstreet, Gettysburg, Appomattox, New Orleans. Gee, Longstreet to this crap. Wonder how that could go. For some of us, of course, Longstreet has been a person of some great significant interest. There are some of us in this room who were involved in the effort to erect a monument to James Longstreet here on the Gettysburg battlefield. On July 3rd, 1998, a bunch of us were in the audience. Some people are wearing the T-shirts even now. When the Longstreet Memorial Monument was unveiled down in Pitzer's Woods. Longstreet is one of those characters who give us an awful lot to think about. What Elizabeth is going to talk about is the product of her new book, Reconsidering Longstreet, Gettysburg, Appomattox, New Orleans, taking us well into the post-war years. One of the things that we often are asked about here is how is the fate of Confederate history landing among the audiences that come to visit us? And for us to be able to give good answers to that, we have to take a long look at the years after the Civil War, and Elizabeth is going to help us do that. Elizabeth is the Langbourne M. Williams Professor of American History at the University of Virginia and a member of the Executive Council of the UVA's John Nau Civil War Center. Her books include Armies of Deliverance, A New History of the Civil War, a book I highly recommend, and it won the Lincoln Prize. I guess that means it's pretty good. Yes, it does. Her most recent book has this title, and as a few of you here, it just recently won a very important award as well. Just recently, the American Battlefield Trust instituted its own Best Book of the Year, Best Civil War Book of the Year award, and Elizabeth has just recently been awarded that one as well. She's a top-flight scholar. She has a lot to share with us. Please help me welcome Elizabeth Varon.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much, Carol, for that kind introduction. So I'm here today to reintroduce you to one of the best known but least understood figures in the American Civil War era, and that, of course, is the Confederate General James Longstreet. The basic outlines of Longstreet's life have been familiar to scholars in the general public for a long time. During the Civil War, Longstreet commanded the Army of Northern Virginia's fabled First Corps. He won laurels in Confederate victories at Second Manassas and Fredericksburg and Chickamauga, among other battles, and earned a reputation as Robert E. Lee's dependable war horse, as Lee put it memorably. After the war, Longstreet became embroiled in a decades-long, truly endless battle over his military performance, over whether he should bear the primary or even the sole blame for the Confederate loss at Gettysburg and ultimate defeat in the war. The vast majority of writing on Longstreet, many of you will know this, has turned on the question of whether he deserved this fate as a scapegoat. His performance here at Gettysburg has been litigated and relitigated over and over and over again, with many negative verdicts offered on his generalship. So I'll propose today that we should widen our focus, that to truly understand Longstreet's Gettysburg story, we have to consider two other places and moments: Appomattox in Virginia in 1865, and New Orleans after the war in 1867. Appomattox and New Orleans were places of epiphany for James Longstreet that shaped his post-war political career, a long, eventful career. At Appomattox, James Longstreet took U.S. Grant's lenient surrender terms to heart and accepted defeat and the invitation to turn the page, as it were. 2 years later in New Orleans, Longstreet made what I think is the most remarkable political about-face in American history. There may be a more remarkable one, I just don't know what it would be. Longstreet announced in a series of public letters his support for the U.S. Congress's revolutionary program for remaking the American South, its program of Reconstruction. The centerpiece of that Reconstruction program was the enfranchisement of black Southern men as voters. In aligning himself with Reconstruction in this way, Longstreet was joining ranks with the Republican Party, which was, in the Civil War era, the party of the North, of Lincoln, of emancipation, of Union victory, of everything Confederates loathed and feared. Most Confederates had been Southern Democrats. Longstreet's political turnaround after the war infuriated ex-Confederates and made him a pariah and prompted, and this will be a big theme of mine, prompted the attacks on his wartime record. That decision to ally with the Republican Party and support Reconstruction also launched Longstreet on a decades-long career as an influential political operative and an iconoclastic critic of his own society who was constantly in the public eye. His distinct voice can help us better understand the elusiveness of reconciliation among Southerners over the meaning of the Civil War. I lost my screen here. Oh, there, we're back. Okay, we're back. Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? Good on volume? All right. So let me set the stage some. So Longstreet's journey from ardent Confederate to ardent Republican was, needless to say, highly unlikely. He was born in 1821 to a slaveholding family with roots in South Carolina and Georgia. He was every bit the product of plantation society. After the death of his father in 1833, Longstreet's main influence was his uncle Augustus Baldwin Longstreet. Augustus Longstreet was a rabid pro-slavery ideologue and secessionist who bred his nephew, young James, to literally to carry the South's banner into battle. And indeed, Longstreet rushed to join the secessionist cause. No hesitation there. He was every bit, Longstreet, a true believer in the Confederacy's racial politics. As a military commander, James Longstreet gave stem-winding speeches to his troops condemning Yankee abolitionism and radicalism. Longstreet tried to preempt and punish the many forms of black resistance to the Confederacy, such as the flight of slaves and their offering of their services as scouts and spies and soldiers to the Union Army. And of course, Longstreet aggressively sought to undermine emancipation during the war through acts such as seizing free blacks in Pennsylvania during the Gettysburg campaign and sending them south as slaves. So every bit a true believer in the Confederate cause and Confederate politics. Longstreet made his name in the war as a military leader in the Eastern Theater, and his stature as Lee's confidant, warhorse, right-hand man, persisted even after the two men's famous disagreement at Gettysburg, where, as you all surely know, Longstreet implored Lee in vain to fight on the tactical defensive rather than launching the ill-advised offensives of July 2nd and 3rd. In hindsight, of course, critics would question Longstreet's performance at Gettysburg. They would question his motives. And they would insinuate, some of the harshest ones, that his conduct was treasonous or bordered on treasonous. But it's crucial to note three things about Gettysburg, and we can return to this topic during the Q&A. If you'd like. First thing we ought to remember is that Longstreet, in his own in-the-moment accounts of Gettysburg, stressed his ultimate deference to Lee. not their disagreements, but his ultimate deference to Lee. For example, Longstreet waved off John Bell Hood's proposal for a July 2nd flank attack by saying, quote, "We must obey the orders of General Lee." This was Longstreet's mantra. Second thing to remember, the various setbacks and false starts that delayed the July 2nd offensive were, in Longstreet's view, meant to improve the odds, not to lessen the odds of Confederate success on July 2nd. In other words, he and Lee disagreed about how to achieve victory, not about whether to achieve it. That fact gets muddied some in the criticisms of Longstreet. Finally, and perhaps most importantly for my purposes here today, Longstreet's exalted reputation among Confederates remained intact after Gettysburg. Confederates during the war itself, in the aftermath of Gettysburg, did not single him out as a scapegoat for Gettysburg or for other military reverses for that matter, nor did they question his commitment to the cause. And yet, we can discern over the course of the war some changes in Longstreet's morale and outlook that do somewhat prefigure what is to come. Longstreet begins, particularly in the second half of the war, to contemplate grimly the possibility of Confederate defeat. To put it another way, Longstreet's belief in the Confederate cause didn't waver over the long course of the war, but his confidence in the cause did waver. It was shaken. As Confederate infighting and strategic miscalculations and logistical woes hampered the war effort, Longstreet began to brood over what he saw as the fatal flaws that beset Southern society, especially as he saw it, as he put it, the flaw of arrogance, of underestimating one's foe. "It is a bad principle in war to despise your enemy," Longstreet wrote at the start of the doomed Knoxville, Tennessee campaign in the winter of 1863. He's temporarily posted in the West at this point. And it's no coincidence that Longstreet struck a desponding note at this particular juncture, because this is the first time he found himself in the same theater of war as U.S. Grant. Here's a Gettysburg slide I should have shifted to earlier. I'm not much with PowerPoint, but we'll come to this guy in just a second. So Longstreet struck a desponding note when he found himself in the West in the same theater of war as one U.S. Grant. The two men had, of course, been dear friends, besties at West Point, classmates, family friends, wives were friends, etc. "I know him through and through," Longstreet warned his fellow Confederates of Grant. "That man will fight us every day and every hour till the end of this war." This warning about Grant's ability to make the Confederates pay for their dysfunction, this proved prophetic. In 1864, 1865, as we all know, as Grant's attritional strategy wore down Lee's army. Longstreet himself was grievously wounded at the Battle of the Wilderness in May of 1864. He returned to his command that October. And of course, we're now going to shift to our second important location. The Confederate military collapse resulting in the fall of Richmond and Petersburg set the stage for the famous surrender meeting at Appomattox in central Virginia, April 9, 1865, where Grant, depicted here in this rather poor painting, offered Lee the lenient terms of surrender by parole. So what does that mean? In exchange for their pledge that they would never again take up arms against the United States, Confederates were essentially set free to go home unpunished. Now, Grant intended for this leniency to secure Confederate repentance and atonement and acceptance of defeat and compliance with the new order. But it proved difficult, as we all know, to change hearts and minds. Many of the men in Lee's army held out hope that the war was somehow not really lost. Longstreet stands out here. He was singular in the extent to which he, as a Confederate, personalized the surrender terms. He personalized them. He viewed them through the lens of his friendship with U.S. Grant. Longstreet, in other words, again, almost singularly, understood the surrender terms in precisely the spirit in which Grant intended them, as an invitation for Southerners, errant and repentant brethren, to return to the national fold. In Longstreet's telling, a brief encounter he had with Grant on April 10, the day after the surrender, 1865, was broadly symbolic of the promise of national reunion. The two men, Grant and Lee, their paths cross April 10 at the McLean House, where Longstreet and other commissioners are hashing out some of the details of the parole process. Grant sees Longstreet and extends his hand in friendship with his old-time cheerful greeting, as Longstreet remembered, and the two men embraced. Grant acted as though nothing had happened to mar the ties that had existed between us before the war, Longstreet would later recall. Grant put his arm within mine and said with the same affection of old, "Pete, let's go back to the good old times and play a game of brag as we used to." Grant's act of personal grace at Appomattox would have an enduring impact on James Longstreet and on his politics and his post-war fortunes. But now I'm going to shift the scene to our third setting. After the war, Longstreet settled in New Orleans. He saw it as a city that was dynamic, full of economic opportunity. He achieved some economic success working as a cotton broker. And Longstreet was, in the immediate aftermath of the war in New Orleans, viewed by his fellow Confederates as a great hero, great Southern hero of the war. In other words, no damage to his reputation from Gettysburg or from the ultimate defeat at Appomattox. Demonstrating his acceptance of that defeat, Longstreet formally renewed his fealty to the Union. He took the oath of allegiance of May of 1865. But the peace would prove fragile. I have to provide a sort of primer on Reconstruction politics here to explain why. The new president, Andrew Johnson, the Tennessee Unionist and Jacksonian Democrat who took office after Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865, began very quickly to endanger the peace with his policies. He empowered the defeated South, emboldened them through his excessive leniency to brazenly unrepentant, defiant, reactionary Confederates. Johnson pardoned them by the thousands. He permitted them to return to power in the South and to impose on the freed people, those who had been enslaved, a subordinate status that was very close to slavery. Andrew Johnson went to war, essentially, with the Republican Congress, vetoing its efforts to grant the freed people some basic rights and protections of citizenship. And so Congress pushed back with its own more stringent Reconstruction program spelled out in the Reconstruction Acts it passed in March of 1867, also tried unsuccessfully to impeach Johnson and throw him out of office. The essence of Congress's program was that it enfranchised black men in the South, formerly enslaved men, and it tasked new electorates in the South, made up of loyal citizens, to set up new governments. Congress was, in essence, establishing biracial Republican Party governing coalitions in the South so that the victors in the war could safeguard their victory rather than having the defeated return to power. So in Louisiana, where Longstreet now lives, congressional Reconstruction goes into effect in March of 1867 under the direction of Phil Sheridan, who was military governor there. Reconstruction was opposed and decried by the vast majority of former Confederates, most of whom, again, were Democrats and supported Johnson's excessive leniency. So this is the setting in which James Longstreet is invited by the local press in New Orleans to weigh in, and he makes the shocking announcement that he had changed course and was going to side now with his former enemies. On March 18, 1867, Longstreet wrote to the New Orleans Times the following, quote, "There can be no discredit to a conquered people for accepting the conditions offered by their conquerors, nor is there any occasion for a feeling of humiliation. We made an honest, and I hope I may say a creditable fight, but we have lost. Let us come forward then and accept the ends involved in the struggle. Let us accept the terms," reference to Appomattox and Grant, "let us accept the terms as we are in duty bound to do." Longstreet in these letters cast black voting in the South as a fait accompli, something that should be accepted and perhaps tested in the North. So, needless to say, Longstreet's provocative letters, published in the New Orleans press initially, but then reprinted around the country, Longstreet's provocative letters announcing this support for Reconstruction ignited a political firestorm. Southern newspapers opposed to Reconstruction reacted with incredulity and wrath. They called Longstreet Judas. They called him Benedict Arnold. They called him Lucifer. They condemned him for his wanton, wicked desertion of his friends and his country. It has become a subject of regret that the wound he received at the Battle of the Wilderness was not mortal. The Mobile Daily Tribune, an Alabama paper, editorialized, "We would have then been spared the mortification of seeing him side by side with the enemies of his country and of his race." A typical response. Longstreet's critics saw him as a clear and present danger to lost cause ideology, a form of pro-Southern propaganda that glorified slavery and the Confederacy, that denigrated the Union victory as a illegitimate triumph of might over right, overwhelming numbers and resources and so on. Lost cause ideology, too, promised that military defeat would be followed by political vindication, and Longstreet was challenging all of these assumptions. So all of this turmoil, of course, begs the question, why? How can we explain Longstreet's turnabout? The traditional explanation among his former biographers was that Longstreet was in over his head, that he was an inept politician, hampered by political naivete, and therefore he misrepresented his own true intentions, which were, as much as possible, to restore the old pre-war social order. These previous biographers have speculated that if Longstreet had only been able to more clearly communicate his own conservatism to his fellow Southern whites, he wouldn't have been branded a traitor. Now, I would argue, and do argue in my book, that this image of Longstreet as misunderstood doesn't fully capture his political views or their evolution. Longstreet makes at this moment in 1867 in New Orleans an enduring commitment to the Republican Party, one motivated by three main factors, and I'll say a few words about each. I'll really linger on the third. The first factor is a sense of duty to his kinfolk. The second factor is pragmatic calculations about who he should trust, which political leaders he should trust. And the third factor is his exposure to a unique political climate in New Orleans, and I'll tell you a little bit about each. Reflecting the first of these factors, a sense of duty, Longstreet's letters on Reconstruction blended the personal and the political. One of those letters, written on April 6, contains a passage that's deeply revealing of Longstreet's mindset, so I will read it to you in its entirety. Longstreet wrote, again, this is in one of the published letters announcing his change of course. Longstreet wrote, quote, "The soldier prefers to have the sod that receives him when he falls cover his remains. The political questions of the war should have been buried upon the fields that marked their end. Our most cherished objects of this earth, blood of our blood, life of our life, if not duly deposited as ordained by an all-wise providence, becomes offensive. So it must be with this dead matter. If the last funeral rites of the Southern Confederacy have not been performed, let us with due solemnity proceed to the discharge of that painful duty, and let us deposit in the same grave the agony of our grief, that we may better prepare ourselves for a return to the duties of this life." The Confederacy as dead matter, deserving funeral rites. Depositing the agony of our grief, he says, in the same grave. So Longstreet at this moment is channeling a very intimate agony, and that is the crushing blow he'd endured in the winter of 1862 during the war, with the deaths of 3 young children in the space of 1 week to scarlet fever. 3 young children lost in the space of 1 week. He is shattered by this. His reference in this April 6th letter to our most cherished objects of this earth, blood of our blood, life of our life, is a window into the lasting trauma of this loss and into how he soldiered on at a personal level by burying the dead and the past. To survive, you have to bury the dead and the past. So a sense of duty to his people, to his family, to give them a life of peace and serenity, allow them to turn the page, is a powerful motivator. A second powerful motivator at the heart of this political conversion is his admiration for U.S. Grant. I've already referred to this. I'll say a few more words about it. In Longstreet's mind, Grant was the alternative. Grant the statesman, Grant the leader, Grant the sort of symbol of magnanimity and forgiveness and reunion. Longstreet was the alternative to the reckless divisiveness of Andrew Johnson, who was just a kind of disaster in every way. Grant and his magnanimity represented, as Longstreet would put it, the prospect that the South, purified from the blight of human slavery, would grow and flourish. Increasingly disgusted by Andrew Johnson's incompetence, Grant himself, though Grant was no abolitionist when the war started, he had his own sort of journey of evolution, as Lincoln did. Grant had come to see congressional Reconstruction and black voting as the only way to safeguard the Union's victory at Appomattox. And so Grant was chosen as the Republican Party's nominee in 1868, running on a platform of sectional harmony and the guarantee of the newly won rights of former slaves, of the freed people. Longstreet chooses Grant to support, casts his lot with him, because Grant and the Republicans, it seems to Longstreet, genuinely want peace and reunion, while the Southern Democrats, the lost cause types, the Jubal Early types, are bitterly waging war by political means, essentially, haven't given up. So now we come to perhaps the most important and surprising factor in Longstreet's political conversion, and that is the role of the political culture of New Orleans itself. New Orleans had a distinct Afro-Creole leadership class dating back to the pre-war years that was uniquely positioned to challenge James Longstreet's views on race relations, and to reform those views. That distinct Afro-Creole leadership class included some mixed-race men with French or Spanish lineage and deep roots in the region, back to the era of a French and Spanish colonial rule in Louisiana. The leadership class also included some American blacks from outside that's French and Spanish milieu, men such as P.B.S. Pinchback, whose picture you see before you. Pinchback hailed from Macon, Georgia, and has made his way to New Orleans during the war and then settled there afterwards. Many of the men in this black leadership class, gens de couleur libre as they were known, free men of color, including Pinchback, had been part of a small cadre of black commissioned officers in Union regiments during the Civil War. We all know from the movie Glory that most of the commanders of black regiments were whites, but there were some black commissioned officers, line officers, who could lead men in battle, about 100 or so. Most of them came from this milieu. And their identities as soldiers and officers gave these men a point of connection to Longstreet. So, not surprisingly, New Orleans' black leaders, the vanguard in the state's Republican Party, the men at the forefront of Reconstruction, they were initially skeptical of Longstreet's support, of his professed change of heart. The Afro-Creole newspaper, the New Orleans Tribune, argued after Longstreet's letters were first published that he was perhaps not to be trusted as a true ally. The paper speculated that Longstreet hoped the experiment of black voting would fail so that it would be rejected forever. But by 1869, this same newspaper, the Tribune, had changed its tune. It wrote of Longstreet, this black newspaper in New Orleans wrote of Longstreet in February of 1869 that he was, quote, an apostle of ideas of tolerance and progress, unquote. An apostle of ideas of tolerance and progress, and that others should follow his wise example. Now, this paper came to trust Longstreet because he proved to be so vocal in his criticisms of Andrew Johnson and vocal in his support for U.S. Grant. In a provocative series of interviews, Longstreet loved an interview. He has a reputation as being a kind of gruff, taciturn man of few words. No, he was a voluble, opinionated guy and didn't hesitate to lean in when given the opportunity. He gave a series of interviews that criticized Andrew Johnson for feeding the South with, as Longstreet put it, false hope of recovering the supremacy they had lost. Longstreet lamented the, quote, infernal tyranny of politicians who will hold on as long as a breath of popularity remains to the most fossilized or exploded political theories. Longstreet was not yet a radical Republican, but a crucial dynamic was emerging that would shape his political evolution. That is to say, the more his white Southern critics, former Confederates, treated him as Lucifer, as an apostate on the issue of race, as a traitor to the cause, the more receptive he became to Republican ideology, because the Republicans welcomed him with open arms. They sort of were willing to let him finesse the issue of loyalty. Indeed, the Republicans went out of their way to commend Longstreet's military prowess, because the more prominent he'd been as a Confederate soldier, the more significant he could be as a symbol of repentance, as a kind of get. Yes, you were a great general, and therefore your embracing us is even more important than it would be if you were not so esteemed. So after U.S. Grant wins the 1868 election, he rewards Longstreet's loyalty by appointing Longstreet to a plum patronage position as surveyor of the Customs House in New Orleans. This is a big, sort of lucrative position. And Longstreet soon, in that position as a bureaucrat, courted controversy in New Orleans by nominating black men for positions in this federal bureaucracy in the surveyor's office. Equally surprising was Longstreet's willingness to join with black activists like PBS Pinchback in celebrating milestones in the freedom struggle. Longstreet helped organize in 1870 a grand gala celebration of the 15th Amendment, which gave the vote to African American men across the country. The ante is upped. And here, by the way, is Longstreet, the politician, in his post-war garb. The ante was upped when Louisiana's Republican governor, Henry Warmoth, a Union veteran, called on Longstreet to assume a controversial new role as the chief of staff of a newly constituted Louisiana state militia, which was formed by this Republican coalition during Reconstruction. The new militia had black regiments led by black officers. It had white regiments led by whites. Warmoth hoped that Longstreet could act as a sort of mediator between the disparate elements of this militia. But again, defying expectations. In other words, what we're seeing here is Longstreet doubling down again and again on his commitment to the Republican Party. Longstreet, again defying expectations, uses this role as chief of staff to conspicuously promote black military service and the aspirations of black soldiers and officers. For example, during an elaborate review ceremony for the 2nd Regiment of the state militia, Longstreet singled out the black officers for praise, speaking about them in the most complimentary manner, as a local Republican paper put it. And this choice by the Louisiana governor to appoint Longstreet to this important role seemed to pay off when the Republicans win a sweeping electoral victory in state elections in 1870. They had passed election laws, created a security apparatus that made it possible for them to get this affirmation. Any such momentum, however, for post-war Reconstruction was tragically impossible to maintain. White conservatives mounted a swift backlash against the emerging new order through an extensive network of secret paramilitary political organizations. The Klan and organizations like it in Louisiana, one called the Knights of the White Camellia, was particularly active. In other words, there was an expanding shadow army, as the scholar Cadata Williams has written, that attacked and assassinated black voters and their white allies, especially during election season, using some of the same violent tactics enslavers had. In Louisiana, during the 1868 election campaign, at least 1,000 political murders were committed, and this means white and black Republicans harassed and attacked in an effort by Southern Democrats, that they called themselves large C conservatives, to drive the Republican Party out of Southern life and out of Southern politics. So New Orleans just descends into a maelstrom. There are a series of street battles between Republicans and Democrats that seal the city's reputation as a hot spot on the sort of brink of boiling over. Factionalism roils the Republican Party to sort of make matters worse. Governor Warmoth is in battle. He breaks with President Grant and advocates rolling back Reconstruction and removing federal troops from the South. This is a bit of a juncture where Longstreet has to decide whether to stick with Grant and Reconstruction or whether to remain loyal to Warmoth, and Longstreet breaks with Warmoth. He backs Grant, and he backs PBS Pinchback and Senator William Pitt Kellogg and other radical Republicans in New Orleans. Again, this moments of choice like this give the lie to the idea that Longstreet sort of got out over his skis. There were many off-ramps for him politically if he had wanted to step away from the Republican Party, but instead, whenever he comes to one of these crossroads, he doubles down, and here again, he doubles down. He gives an interview in which he publicly praises Pinchback, saying Pinchback, quote, possessed the coolest brains and the shrewdest faculties of any public man in the state. In other words, this Afro-Creole leadership class has made an impression on Longstreet. He's grown to respect these men, and he works with them. And remarkably, Pinchback and William Kellogg, as the successive governors of Louisiana, will reciprocate Longstreet's trust by making him commander of a revamped extended state militia force. And remarkably, again, the elements of this story that you just couldn't make up if you tried. They're so unexpected, given the place and time here. Remarkably, in Longstreet's command hierarchy, when he is in charge of this Louisiana state militia, are two black brigadier generals. Both of them, Alexander E. Barber and Thomas Morris Chester, accomplished civil rights activists, very outspoken civil rights activists, these among the very first black men in American history to hold the rank of brigadier general in Longstreet's militia. So Longstreet's influence within the Republican Party is at a peak at this point, 1870, 71, 72, but his hopes for lasting change are about to come crashing down as Louisiana descends further into an abyss of reactionary anti-black violence. Ex-Confederates in the militia mutiny against Longstreet. They refuse to follow him. Paramilitary units calling themselves White Leagues explode on the scene in New Orleans and Louisiana in the summer of 1874. They arm themselves to the teeth. They gather thousands of men under their banner. And in hit-and-run strikes and murderous sprees, these White Leaguers attack Republicans, force them out of office, terrorize black communities and families across the state. They also engage in a campaign of misinformation. They spread false rumors that so-called black leagues, there were no such things, but that so-called black leagues were planning a July 4th assault in 1874 in which black militiamen would attack white businesses and homes. Completely untrue propaganda that was spread to try to gin up tensions. Longstreet denied the existence of these so-called black leagues, but the rumor mill churned in New Orleans, and as summer turned to fall in 1874 in New Orleans, the entire city was on edge, and finally the fuse was lit and the political powder keg exploded. On September 14th, 1874, White Leaguers held a mass meeting at the Henry Clay statue on Canal Street, in which they demanded the abdication of the Republican state government and cried, "Hang Kellogg," that was the name of the governor. A crowd of nearly 5,000 White Leaguers went to work. They occupied City Hall and the telegraph office. They erected barricades. They cut the telegraph wires to isolate the city. They put pickets and snipers in place along a defensive line that they created. This is a white supremacist coup d'etat trying to overthrow the duly elected Republican coalition government of New Orleans and Louisiana at bayonet point. So Longstreet's the head of the militia. He's keen to defend the state government. He and his militia units are initially in a defensive posture at the State House in Jackson Square in New Orleans. And these are depictions here you see on screen, Longstreet trying to rally his troops and his militiamen clashing with White Leaguers in images from the time of this battle, and it really becomes a battle. Longstreet learns that the mass of white Leaguers have left the clay statue vicinity and are streaming down to the levee. He orders his force to meet the movement of the insurgents and establish a battle line at the base of Canal Street. The insurgents assail Longstreet's position. Longstreet's men open fire, white Leaguers letting loose the rebel yell, some of whom had been men Longstreet led in the Confederate Army, break the militia's lines, send its men reeling back towards the Custom House and State House. Longstreet, again, you can see that here, tries to rally the retreating militia troops. He tries in vain, but by that time their spirit is broken. They were literally outgunned. There had been a kind of arms race, and the white Leaguers had proven, alas, very successful in arming themselves. Longstreet sustains a minor wound, re-injuring the arm that had been disabled at the Wilderness, and white Leaguers essentially disperse the forces of the Republican Party of Kellogg and the militia and install a Democratic governor named D.B. Penn as governor of Louisiana. And this man rules his stolen kingdom for a few days until federal troops show up and return Kellogg and the Republicans to power. But this September 14, 1874 Battle of Canal Street, we're 10 years out from the Civil War nearly, and there's pitched battle in the street of New Orleans. This Battle of Canal Street presages the end of Reconstruction in Louisiana. The writing's on the wall. There's no recovering for this project. As the historian Justin Nystrom has explained, the U.S. troops who came and took control of the city, quote, failed to pursue those who had mounted a coup against the lawfully recognized civil government of the city, and thus not a single leader or officer or soldier of the White League ever faced criminal prosecution for his role in the bloodshed. Not one person held to account for a coup attempt. In September 21, 1874, a week after these events, Longstreet gave an interview with a Northern correspondent. And in that interview, Longstreet reflected on the state of feeling in the South. He called it very unsatisfactory and discreditable to the Southern people. And Longstreet then observed the following, again, a long quote I will read you. He said, quote, men can't all think alike, and the trouble with the Southern people always has been that they won't tolerate any difference of opinion. If God Almighty had intended all men to think just alike, he might just as well have made but one man. My opinion is that the only true solution for Southern troubles is for the people to accept cordially and in good faith all the results of the war, including the Reconstruction measures, the acts of Congress, Negro suffrage, etc., and live up to them like men. The Southern people, Longstreet continued, were, quote, their own worst enemies, unquote. Now we're going to return to Gettysburg here as I move into the final portions of this lecture. Longstreet is demoralized by this New Orleans pitched battle. He's in ill health. And he begins in the winter of 1874 and 75 a process of switching his political base of operations from Louisiana to Georgia, where he has kinfolk and roots. And he resettles in Georgia, in Gainesville, Georgia. But his fighting days were far from over, because even as he leaves behind the dangerous terrain of New Orleans, he begins to venture more deeply into the battlefield of Civil War memory. In 1872, many of you will know this story and this timeline, and the timing of all this is very significant. In 1872, a group of Confederate veterans in the late Robert E. Lee's inner circle began to pin the Confederate loss at Gettysburg on Longstreet, charging him with delaying the crucial attack on the Federal left flank on July 2nd, 1863. And the timing is not coincidental. 1872 is the height of Longstreet's commitment to the Republican Party, his visibility, his political activism, his own radicalism. Longstreet's detractors, Early and Pendleton and others who will jump into the fray, explicitly connected his alleged wartime treachery with his post-war conduct in Louisiana. They insinuated again that maybe Longstreet's heart had never been in the cause during the war, and so on. And indeed, the more deeply Longstreet became implicated in Republican politics, the more receptive white Southerners became to criticisms of his war record. And I'll give you one particularly striking example. The editors of a Dallas, Texas paper called the Herald revealed in October of 1874, that's just a month after the Canal Street battle, that at first they hadn't really believed Early's charges of Longstreet's insubordination at Gettysburg. But since Longstreet's appearance at the head of the militia, prepared to hurl his messengers of death upon the citizens of New Orleans, as this Dallas paper put it, its editors proclaimed, "We withdraw our incredulity and are prepared now to believe that no deed of infamy could be named or conceived that Longstreet would not gladly be a party to." In the ensuing decades, Longstreet's critics would keep up the image of him as a race traitor who had promoted social equality during his years in Louisiana politics. Rather than taking the bait, Longstreet steered clear in the 1880s and 1890s of these controversies, largely political, partisan ones. He focused instead on securing a series of federal patronage positions, building a new set of Republican alliances in Georgia, and defending his military record in a series of essays and interviews and speeches, and in this massive book that some of you will have read, From Manassas to Appomattox, his extensive memoir from 1896, 690-page memoir. In this book, Longstreet reveals that in this last phase of his life, post-New Orleans, he was eager to claw back some of his lost popularity with Southern whites. And so he refashions himself in this book as a herald of sectional reunion, a guy who could see long before anyone else would that both sides were going to have to make some concessions if they were really going to come together. He portrayed himself as someone who was proud of his Confederate record, eager to clasp hands along with other veterans in this sort of symbolic brotherhood of the blue and gray, clasping hands across the bloody chasm. As he prepared his memoir, Longstreet used interviews and speeches to press the case, again back to Appomattox, that Appomattox had been the defining moment of his career, that he had taken part in Reconstruction to uphold the terms of his Appomattox parole. And one of the sort of more memorable lines of the memoir is Longstreet saying, "Those who are forgiven most love the most." So again, this sense of gratitude to Grant for his magnanimity. Even as it featured this theme of North-South reconciliation, and I'm coming to the end here, bear with me a couple more minutes. Even as it featured this theme of North-South reconciliation, Longstreet's memoir also provoked his Southern critics by drawing a sharp contrast between Grant and Robert E. Lee. According to the memoir, Lee lacked some of the qualities of character, calmness, adaptability, generosity of spirit that in Longstreet's view were exemplified by Grant. They were equally pugnacious and plucky, Longstreet averred, but Grant had the key edge as a commander because he was the more deliberate, less likely to be carried away by emotion, as Longstreet charged in this memoir that Lee was at Gettysburg. By highlighting Grant's skill in leadership, Longstreet was again spurning the lost cause argument that the Union had won only because of its brute force. Longstreet was more eager than ever, the way to sort of sum up this last chapter of his life and the sort of trend lines that we see visible in the memoir, is that he's more determined, more eager than ever in the last years of his life to somehow try to reconcile his Confederate past and his Republican affiliation. When he's buried in 1904 in Gainesville, Georgia, after dying of pneumonia, his casket is bedecked symbolically in both American and Confederate flags. He saw himself as, again, a kind of herald of sectional reunion. But it proved impossible to reconcile the dissonant aspects of Longstreet's life story. And as you all know, controversy would continue to swirl around him long after his death. So at annual commemorations in Louisiana of the 1874 Battle of Canal Street, or Battle of Liberty Place, as white supremacists called it, there were invariably, each and every year on the anniversary of this battle, waves of invective by speakers in New Orleans chastising Longstreet for having been a traitor to the cause. That white supremacist coup attempt was memorialized in 1891 with a stone obelisk in New Orleans. You see it depicted there. And that was essentially an anti-Longstreet monument put up to celebrate the defeat of the Republican forces. Across the South, but especially in Virginia, of course, acolytes of Robert E. Lee would obsessively relitigate the Battle of Gettysburg and blame Longstreet for losing it. Longstreet's wife, Helen Dortch, 42 years his junior, his second wife, would enter the fray. She'd attempt to defend his military record and his post-war statesmanship and somehow to harmonize them. She began a campaign to erect a statue to him here at Gettysburg, but she didn't live to see it through. She died in 1962 at the age of 99, lived until 1962, the second wife. An equestrian statue, you see it here, of course, was eventually unveiled at Gettysburg in 1998. It was the work principally of a North Carolina division of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and revealingly, they pointedly insisted that the purpose of the statue was to honor Longstreet's wartime record, not his post-war politics, which remained very controversial. So to close, in recent year, America's long overdue reckoning with Confederate memorialization has reframed Longstreet's life and legacy, and people have remarked on the absence of statues in Longstreet's honor in the South, and a spate of public opinion pieces asked rhetorically over the past 5 to 10 years, where are the monuments to General Longstreet? And the answer, of course, is that his embrace of post-war Reconstruction and the Republican Party made him unfit as a symbol of the Confederacy and the lost cause. And so there were no statues of Longstreet blanketing the South, there were statues of Lee and Jackson and Jefferson Davis and so on. As statues of Lee and Davis and others have come down, some commentators have called for new statues of Longstreet to be put up in the South in recognition of his post-war political courage. But I would argue that Longstreet has never fit the profile of a marble man whose story could be set in stone. His political evolution and public image were too complex and too contradictory, as I've tried to show, for that. We have to remember that Longstreet fought the Civil War to win it. And if he had succeeded, slavery would have persisted, and his own remarkable reinvention would have never come to pass. To me, the surrender of my sword was my Reconstruction. I looked upon the lost cause as a cause totally, irrevocably lost. So Longstreet mused in 1880, capturing why he's been the most embattled figure from America's Civil War. In the face of the intransigence of ex-Confederates, his greatest provocation was his willingness to change. Longstreet spurned the white South's demand for ideological purity, and that was enough to cast him forever as a Judas in the eyes of those who rejected change. Longstreet accepted defeat with a measure of grace, and for that he commands our attention as one of the most enduringly relevant voices in American history. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have to go because we got to get you out to the signing table so you have time, Dr. Varon, to sign some more books. You want to continue the discussion on Longstreet, you have to get a copy of Longstreet, and then you have to continue this conversation with Dr. Varon. Before you all leave, let me make a couple announcements. So we appreciate so much Dr. Varon's time and coming to see us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you all. A great pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you. Appreciate Carol Reardon, the chair of our education committee, Chris Gwynn, our chief of interpretation and education, and of course all of you for attending. And once again, if you're not a member of the Gettysburg Foundation, please help us help the Gettysburg National Military Park. All you got to do is walk on Little Round Top to know how important your help is. So you can stop at the Friends Desk, take out a membership, upgrade your membership, make a donation. They'll be happy to help you there. And the last announcement I'd like to make is we will begin our Sacred Trust lectures tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. and it has been decided to move them inside tomorrow. So all of you will be in this room tomorrow for Sacred Trust beginning at 9:30 in the morning. So we hope you have a great afternoon and thank you for coming.